Hello students, so this is the second half of my video on the ethics of agriculture. I'm sorry this is so long, I just have a lot to say about this topic, and even so I'm doing a really brief overview of all the different things we could think about along the lines of agriculture. So far we talked a little bit about slash and burn, we talked about monocrop. Both of those impact the rainforest a lot, and so I ended the last section of this video talking about some of the reasons to preserve the rainforest. So going forward from there, I'm just going to talk about two more issues with agriculture, and then we'll leave it there. So the first one I want to talk about here is genetically modified organisms. So a genetically modified organism is an organism that has gone through a process of genetic engineering, where some genes from whole different organisms have been spliced into the genetic material of the one that we are looking at. Later this year, we're going to talk a lot about this process and how it works, but really quick overview, you're able to use something called a restriction enzyme, where you cut out a gene of interest, you put it into something called a plasmid, which is basically a really small section of DNA in a bacteria, and then you can put that plasmid into different organisms, for example, a plant, and then you can have a genetically modified plant. Most of the corn grown in the United States, most of the soy grown in the United States are genetically modified organisms. A lot of other organisms, a lot of other plants are genetically modified as well. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of genetically modified organisms. So some of the advantages is that you can increase insect resistance. So if you take a gene from something that is insect resistant and put it into a plant, then that plant can have more insect resistance and less chemical pesticides would need to be used. It can create more nutritious foods. So if you take the gene for something that is nutritious and put it into the organism that you are looking at, then it may create more nutritious foods. It can decrease costs of growing and farming. So there's an asterisk here because there's a lot of different issues about this point. The idea is that it could decrease costs of growing and farming, but too often it actually does the exact opposite. But a lot of people who are for genetically modified organisms would argue that they do decrease the costs of growing and farming. And it can cause higher crop yields, meaning you can get more food from the same amount of land. So we know our population is getting larger, and so in order to support the population of humans, we would need more food to be grown in certain areas. That being said, there are some disadvantages of genetically modified organisms as well. For example, there's always a risk that those genes that were put into the organism would be more likely to be transferred to other organisms. For example, cross-pollination with a weed species may have that weed species also be resistant towards other pests or resistance towards chemical pesticides. And so that gene transfer can be dangerous. It also is kind of unfair. In order to be an organic farmer, you can't have any genetically modified organisms, and sometimes these things get cross-pollinated from non-organic farms, and then organic farmers will lose their organic status. Genetically modified organisms can increase the chance of superweeds or super pests evolving. Those would be different weeds or pests that are resistant towards many different pesticides. They can increase allergic reactions because you can take a gene that someone may be allergic to from a whole different organism and then put it into that new organism, and there's been some evidence those allergies can carry over. The use of genetically modified organisms can also decrease how well antibiotics work. And the reason for that is a lot of the research done with genetically modified organisms in order to put the genes where you want. You attach those genes to genes for antibiotic resistance. That way you can grow them on bacterial plates, and then if you put some antibiotic there and they still grow, you know you have the gene that you want. And so if that same antibiotic resistance gets into the food that we eat, that can increase or decrease how well antibiotics work in other places. There's also a lot of geopolitical implications of genetically modified organisms. For example, a lot of Europe is really against GMOs, and a lot of the United States provides aid to Africa that is genetically modified, and then African countries can't sell their food to Europe, and so those African countries are more dependent on the United States, and there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. I did want to talk about this one because just a couple of weeks ago, there was a idea on our last ballot. It was called Proposition 105, and the idea is that you'd have to label genetically modified foods because a lot of the foods we eat, they are genetically modified. We might not know that. It didn't pass. It wasn't even close to passing, but it was something that's on our ballot even here in Colorado, so it's definitely a big issue. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit is animal farming. And so when you eat meat, a lot of the meat that is commercially, like you buy from the store, is produced in a factory farm. It's also called intensive animal farming. What those are large industrial operations that raise large numbers of animals for food. Over 99% of farm animals in the US that are used for meat are raised in that way. So some of the advantages of factory farms is that they're super efficient. So here's an image of a whole bunch of pigs that are in a factory farm. You can notice they're all about the same size. They're in the same location. It just makes it really easy to deal with them. So it's easy to provide them all with food. It's easy to make sure that when they're all growing at the same rate, et cetera, et cetera. So that can make it so that there's a large amount of food produced in a really small area. Also, the idea of standardization of product and process. So people, when they go to the grocery store, want to see, a chicken leg that's about the same size every time. And so factory farms increase that. And then it also increases this process. There are some disadvantages to factory farms as well. Like these are some of the places that produce the highest amount of pollution anywhere in the United States. So that pollution would be in the form of concentrated manures and a lot of chemicals that are used in this area can be into the environment as well. Disease in these areas. So obviously when you have all of these different organisms this closely together, it's really easy to spread disease. Therefore, you have to use antibiotics to prevent that disease more than you normally would. If there's a lot of antibiotics in our food, there's some potential health risks with that as well. This idea of power of the wealthy. So a lot of these things are managed by just a couple of organizations, and along with all this agriculture stuff, there's a lot of money that plays in with it, and a lot of factory farms benefit just a few people to the disadvantage of a lot. And then sometimes the conditions for animals in this type of situation may be considered inhumane. And so there's, again, some advantages and disadvantages to factory farming and the way that this is done. Okay, so I talked really briefly about some advantages and disadvantages of 4 different agricultural methods: slash and burn, monocrop farming, genetically modified organisms, and then factory farms. They're just sort of a little introduction to a bunch of these things because a lot of conservation is tied up in these issues. So what I want to leave you with is this idea of what you can do about it. I really like this quote. Well-informed consumers could choose products and services provided by ecologically minded companies. If this were done on a massive scale, companies would provide eco-friendly products and services to attract customers, and those companies which did not would be shunned by consumers and would go out of business. So the idea of this quote is that money talks. Everyone needs food, but we have some choices about how we do agriculture in ways that impact our planet in a more positive way versus a more negative way, like the Michael Pollan quote that we started with. So that money speaks. If you take your money and you buy it from organizations and companies that support what you support, then those companies will become more prevalent. The products they produce are going to become cheaper, etc. So consider that idea next time you go to buy some food.